Welcome to the afternoon session on the executive. And as I mentioned earlier, I thought that in some sense the theme of unveiling is very prominent. And this morning, the idea of party government, which is something I think everyone takes for granted, we see under Harvey's analysis is something that was fashioned and created for modern government. And the afternoon session begins with something parallel. The executive, which is also, of course, taken for granted. How could you have a country without an executive? And it's seen to be created or fashioned, or as Harvey puts it, deliberately contrived, which is even stronger. So in the first case this morning was the leading figure fashioning this doctrine was Burke, and I think for the executive, the leading figures are Machiavelli and our own founders. And that, I think, can be the starting point, the theme of the discussion today. How is this new doctrine of the executive deliberately contrived and created, and what are its characteristics? And also the question, why unveil this now? Why do we need to know this? Why not just leave it as it was, founded by the founders in Machiavelli, and we could forget about it and live in blissful ignorance? So we can open the floor. If anyone else in the panel wants to just give an introductory comment, that would be fine as well.
Not at the moment.
Maybe I'll ask Harvey, just in terms of continuity with the earlier discussion of liberal democracy as a mixed regime. Harvey, you speak in the introduction to The Taming of the Prince about the road not taken, namely the Aristotelian road of addressing the inescapable tyranny in political life, and you say one task is one possible road is the road or path of the Aristotelian king, or the transformation of the tyrant into a king. And I was just wondering if you could say, I know you have a long section in The Taming of the Prince on the absent executive and Aristotle's politics. Is there a sense in which Aristotelian political science simply wasn't prepared to address the exigencies of modernity, of modern politics? Is there a way in which we can conceive executive power better through the light of Aristotelian political science, even if it's not let's say the political science that guided the construction of the modern executive? So anyway, it might be helpful to say a word about, it seems to me your book is an exercise in Aristotelian political science, and yet it highlights the distinctively non or anti-Aristotelian foundations of the modern executive.
Let's let some others speak and let the answer emerge.
Okay.
Disclose itself.
Yeah.
Does the operation of executive power as understood by Machiavelli and tamed, modified by the American founders, does it depend, and to what degree, if so, on an understanding of the underlying teaching, an understanding of what's at stake in it? Do we need, does Machiavelli's teaching need to be revived for the institutional arrangement to work the way it's supposed to work?
In fact, Harvey, you say as much in your chapter on the Federalist, and I wonder if it might not be good to draw that argument out in response to
All right, so somebody want to draw it out? What is the executive, or an executive?
Well, it's ambivalent.
Faulkner's causing trouble.
not as much as Harvey.
He's helping out. And ambivalent, that means two things. What are the two things?
Yeah, Jim.
Well, an executive is the decider without the claim being he decides because he knows, but because a decision has to be made. And then on the other hand, of course, is that weak executive that he's deciding for someone else because of a necessity imposed. So then we need a modern executive, or the modern world needs an executive, I take it the argument is, because no longer is there, to use the phrase that was in one of the writings, maybe this one, I'm not sure, a sovereign good, and no longer is politics organized around the sovereign good that a king might represent, but because the good is private or individual in a Hobbesian way, and so someone has to make decisions on the basis of something other than knowing the good and representing.
He's also a follower, as you point out, chronologically.
A follower in addition to what?
In addition to being a decider, right? So, I mean, there's ambivalence there.
So he's a follower of a decision as well as a maker of a decision.
Right.
Your humble and obedient servant.
And the decision is distinct from the end or the good involved. That's because you've cut down the task of the king from deliberating on what's good to deciding on what needs to be done, i.e. now. So politics becomes about deciding, decision-making, as opposed to sovereignty. I mean, a sovereignty as opposed to what might be the highest good that one aims at.
Yeah, remember the first time I'm going through this, the distinctive thing is when you think of kings and presidents and all leaders somehow being the same, one person having a lot of power. That would be the definition of that. And then to learn, I think what's interesting is that when you say king and when you say president or executive, you really have offices that are extremely different and reveal great differences, so that the word leader doesn't really do justice to what it is. And you see, I remember seeing it, what's involved in this idea of president or executive, what it shows about modern politics as distinct from king, and what that shows about, let's say, the politics of medieval time, how strikingly different they are. When, as I said, you could begin by thinking that these are the same things, and the same offices, doing the same things.
I think, though, wouldn't we want to distinguish president from executive? In other words, I wonder if the word president isn't more king-like in the sense of being the Republican version of a king, one who presides over the deliberation of a Republican community. I mean, there were presidents, right, in the Articles of Congress as the President's Congress, I think. So the name was actually there. It was old for this new office. Now it's called in the Constitution executive power. But we don't refer to him as the executive ordinarily, do we? I mean, and that might again show some respect for that older way of seeing.
There's ambivalence there too, isn't there? The president sits. Literally. He sits, but he sits before. So I think there's some ambivalence.
I suppose not everyone here, especially the younger people here. There are many younger people here. Not everyone here, in fact, is familiar with this extraordinary account of the executive. But the brilliance of the mixture of a kind of a leader who hides himself and has much more authority by virtue of saying there's nobody here but us, people carrying out the law. The brilliance of mixing that account with the decisiveness that's been pointed out, it's just an extraordinary, an extraordinary illumination of modern government. I mean, there are executives everywhere. And to catch this special thing. Could I ask, Harvey, is the full radicalness of this brought out in your account? That is to say, basically this is hidden government.
My namby-pamby account. Can bring out the full radicalness.
I'm stimulated to this question by your own description of the political philosopher, which seems to be fit you perfectly. Toughs of a higher order.
Yeah. Oh well, you've got the original example of Romulus and Remus, and so Romulus disposed of his brother because he wanted to be alone, uno solo. There's your first sort of individual. And it wasn't because he would be a better king than his brother. It was just, and his act was not justified, therefore. It was justified because there needed to be one person. And so I think you start from that, and I try to work a little, of course, in this book with the difference between Machiavelli and liberalism. Whether liberalism is some kind of much more moralized, regularized, constitutionalized view of politics than Machiavelli had, but wasn't there some beginning in Machiavelli where the liberal individual was first found, disclosed, unveiled, unmasked, all of those. Does this mean, therefore, that our system works best because it has its origin in this Machiavellian truth? And the name of my book is not on the model of The Taming of the Shrew, but it's called Taming the Prince, not The Taming of the Prince. I'm telling you, that's for Dan.
Sorry about that.
Write that down in your notebook, or try thinking of Taming the Shrew.
Yes.
Well, in this context, is the extent that the executive is not justified by the good or by a search, or you talk about changing the executive, but does the executive power require justification? Is there something substantive you can say? Are you securing the polity from a threat or not? Is there some way that one can describe the exercise of executive power as legitimate or illegitimate? At page 14, you talk about protecting the weak, and age to be more precise. Does that play an essential justifying role? Is that something that the popular is that something either in Machiavelli or you think in real life, or is that almost an accident? That's one among many ends that the executive may choose to serve or not.
Well, you're on the way to legitimacy when you speak like that, because it's legitimate if you're representing someone that you ought to be representing, and not if not. So that would give you a definite criterion by which to judge an executive act, as opposed to the indefinite criterion of whether it's going to do good or not on the whole. And it's true that the good comes into the Romulus and Remus example, because Machiavelli says it's good that there be uno solo, one person. So it isn't that the good is altogether expelled, but you don't. It doesn't enter into the decision, or it doesn't legitimize the decision. The decision is legitimized if you act for the sake of, or on behalf of, some higher power, who is maybe in some way set over you, superior to you. And so you can, I didn't do it. I just, you understand, I have to smack you around, take your money, but it's a higher power. And I've got a badge, so I'm a legitimate representative. And I'm part of the executive. And you understand, because I'm not arguing with you, and I wish you well. It's just necessità, which impels me.
Well, to put the two sessions together, the first and this one, the party government and the presidency, at least in the United States, the president or executive is also the party leader. So you have the two themes fused. He's part president, but he's also part party leader. And so two functions are now merged into one person. The function of party leader, I think, being probably closer to something kingly, or at least because it points to an idea of the good, which isn't a necessity, but which is a program of a party. So this raises the question about another ambivalence of our modern executive. Insofar as he's executive, can he be party leader? Insofar as he's party leader, is he an executive? And how can these two functions sit together in one? Do the two functions tend to destroy each part, or tend to enhance this office and make it even grander than it was? In any case, it is interesting that these two come together in one office, one person, with problems, I think. Nathan, you?
Well, actually, I was also thinking of the earlier session, and I know I can tie it up with yours. I was thinking in the course of these discussions that why is it that there is almost no reference to the executive in Tocqueville's Democracy in America? He did go visit the president, I recall, but there's no reference to any executive, to governors or to the president, and it's a completely different order that's being discussed there. And I was simply pondering whether when we talk about this in the absence of considering enormous historical changes. Now, one of the reasons he doesn't have to talk about the executive is he doesn't talk about foreign policy. He doesn't talk about military policy. And America did have a foreign policy at the time of some sort. There'd been a war of 1812, and there must have been something after it and so on. But it's happily not there. And of course, that's the only area in which the president has some relatively independent authority. But it is intriguing, how useful the discussion is in the light of the enormous expansion of the executive in other realms. I recall, despite the fact we had already had three assassinated presidents, I recall Pat Moynihan commenting on the size of the Secret Service at the time of Roosevelt, or maybe the time of Kennedy, and it was tiny. I mean, it's been expanded 100-fold. And certainly one of the things it reflects is the rise in the significance of the executive. These are some reflections that I think in the American context, I mean, you have raised this excellent question of how does he combine party presidency with executive role? It's true in many other democracies, same sort of situation. To think of, all I'm saying is it's hard to think of the executive in the abstract in the light of the enormous changes that have occurred to it. I was thinking another remark. I was tempted to make it earlier this morning, and it may relate to my present remark. I was going to intervene and ask what may seem a less than sublime question of Harvey, of why is it the case that America survived, the world survived, with one English translation of Democracy in America for 130 years, and we've had 4 or 5 in the last 10 years. Since 2000, we've had at least 5, I think. And the answer might be institutional, again, historical. Something has happened that makes it irrelevant. I can't imagine what that institutional change that makes it more relevant is. So maybe it's some other kind of institutional change in the world of publishing. So I was thinking that maybe the change is because of the 5 translations have occurred since the end of the Cold War. And the Cold War edition of Tocqueville was the revised Reed-Bowen translation, which was not put out in 1945. And that was before the age of wave of new translations. And I think the difference might be the increasing interest in civil society after the end of the Cold War. I don't know how long that's going to go on, and that was Tocqueville's focus. And maybe that is one reason why there was another Tocqueville wave. It's simply some thoughts, since we all asked our questions.
Well, I certainly see no reason for 4 of those additional translations. That was really, those were quite superfluous. The one that Delma and I did was I don't think provoked by the end of the Cold War, but by the lousy character of the previous or existing one, and our desire to teach Tocqueville from a slightly better version, or a considerably better version than was available. But these, yeah.
I'm struggling with earphones, which aren't working.
Yeah, these more recent translations strike me as quite unnecessary. Yeah. Tocqueville on the executive, he thought that the president should be strong as it was in his understanding in the original Constitution, and as argued in the Federalist, but that it had been overcome by the power of democratization in the time since the founding, and this came to a culmination in Andrew Jackson, whom he thought not to be who he thought was not a strong president, but a weak one, because he didn't strength to Tocqueville meant standing up to the people, not leading them, but standing up to them, not giving them what they want. Because the phrase from the Federalist was servile pliancy. That's what a weak president does, and this is not how our constitutional president was designed. It has president has a number of powers in the Constitution, only one of which is to be the executive of the laws. And when he takes his oath, he doesn't take an oath to execute the laws, but to execute the office. So that's already the stronger picture of the executive, which does resemble a king, and does intimate an independent power in the executive.
And Tocqueville did predict the strength, the rise of executive power once the presidency dealt with larger issues of foreign policy. So he says in Democracy in America, Volume 1, that there's something unnaturally weak about the American executive, and that would change over time as America was dealing with issues of foreign policy. Also, and if you look at the rest of Tocqueville's writings, you see he was a little bit, Raymond Aron called him a Gaullist avant la lettre. He not only was somebody who thought deeply about the greatness of the French nation, but he was concerned about adequate executive authority. Now, for the longest time, he hoped that would be in the form of a king. So he, for prudential reasons, he supported constitutional monarchy in France and later placed his hopes after 1848 in a well-constructed republic. But that republic, was sabotaged very early on by the second Napoleonic despotism. But I think Tocqueville's an interesting case. He's somebody, he doesn't theorize executive power, but he is acutely aware of its place and necessity in modern governance.
Nathan.
The younger Nathan. Just alluding to my cognitive and what Daniel just said. The ambivalence that's not so much talked about in this chapter, but appears emphatically in later chapters, is that of the domestic and foreign military president. And in a way it's clearest in Locke, which is presented as a just kind of convenient coincidence that, oh well, let's have the same guy do both of these and it'll save money if we have only one executive and a commander-in-chief. And of course, it's highly present in Machiavelli's kind of conflict. And in some sense, that is the ambivalence too, that there's a tendency for the domestic peacetime executive to be the mere executor of the laws, though the Machiavellian one does much more than that, even domestically. And for the wartime or just even peacetime commander-in-chief to be making decisions in dispatch, as the Federalist puts it. And then there's just always the tension in which some people wish to subject the commander-in-chief president to the same kinds of constraints that the domestic president is subjected to. And some people want to expand the domestic president's power along the lines of the wartime or commander-in-chief presidents. And insofar as Machiavelli sets for at least some of his successors diplomacy of war over peace and foreign policy over domestic policy, it's clear which one it is.
Catherine's sense is more unequivocal in executive power. What about greatness and executive power? The stuff that Tocqueville say in the book, he sees the aspiration and admiration for greatness as part of human nature, and just presents himself in broad daylight and say, and perhaps no better than anyone else. So that's a big problem for this human for something.
Brian.
Question about forms, formalities from the last session. So, to respect forms and formalities is not always to have it straight to the end. The executive policies characterized. Should we think of
I think it might be useful to keep in mind that the Federalist Papers, which is where most of your emphasis in the last chapter of Taming the Prince is, never really talks about executive power. In effect, what you're arguing is that the Federalist recognizes the need for a strong executive, but it never really spells out the powers. What it does is spell out the virtue of the executive, which is energy, dispatch, but not really so much the powers. There are a few of them that are discussed, but the principal ones aren't really taken up. You don't get a discussion of executive power until you come to the Pacificist Papers. It's only there that Hamilton unveils, unmasks, discloses the full panoply of executive power. And there it's quite breathtaking. I mean, so if you, in one sense, if a powerful executive is the great contribution of the American founders. It reveals itself in stages and not all at once, and not in the work to which we turn principally to understand executive power. We learn a lot about the executive, but not so much about his power, his virtue, as it were.
They had to pussyfoot their way to the understanding of executive power. Pussyfoot, yes, very quietly, because that looked like a king, and they just had a revolution against the king. So if you look at the Constitutional Convention, there was originally the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan, and one of those had an executive elected by Congress, and the other had an executive committee. So in both cases, a weak executive. So only at the end of the convention do they come to that. Also, then when you get to the Federalist, you're not told that one of their discoveries, one of the great discoveries of modern political science, is the need for an ambivalent or a strong executive power. No, that's not listed. And it's only I think maybe about halfway through, or in the 30s. I can't remember exactly. That the energy of executive power is alluded to. Yeah, so I think you're quite right. And of course that turned out to be the strength of the executive turned out to be a great partisan issue in the very debate you brought up, Pacificus Helvetius. Yeah.
Jim?
Jim Muller. One of the really wonderful remarks you make, Harvey, in this is that no one talks about the executive process. But I imagine somebody now might write a book called The Executive Process. And it could be applicable, for instance, to the way that the meaning of the healthcare bill has only very gradually been revealed over the years since it was passed by Congress leading to the bill that was in it. And I wonder whether that's another part of this ambivalence. I mean, it might be an abuse of the office as well, but it's connected perhaps with the idea of the administrative state that Bill was talking about.
I'm Ralph Hancock still. But I would have thought that the ground or a ground of the ambivalence of executive power is in the ambivalence or self-deception of the people. Namely, the people need and want executions, but they don't want to know it or face up to that necessity. They want to live in an orderly and moral and democratic system. So the people want to have it both ways, and executive power is about letting them believe that they have it both ways. This came to mind because I was trying to cast my mind about in Democracy in America to see when there was something that resonated with this character of the people in relation to the problem of executive power. And it strikes me, there towards the end of Volume 1, some of the nastiest things that Tocqueville says about the American people are when he's talking about the three races, and when he says, some of you can paraphrase more precisely than I, but something to the effect that how legalistic the American people are, but how they have their way with the Native Americans within the forms of legality. Where does that stand with respect to the responsible use of executive power? It's almost as if the ambivalence of executive power is on display there without it being responsibly led, executed by a domesticated chief executive.
Yes, it seems legalism and realism feed each other. Using the law becomes a realistic way of evading the law and going beyond it. And so people who are good at expanding the executive are also good at pretending to be legal. So there is this problem of cutting to the end in the executive. It's something like the problem I was speaking of this morning about American desire to, a belief in can-do versus the American belief in due process. Yeah, as if you want to do it legally, as it ought to be in the proper way, until finally, if you're frustrated, and screw it, and go right to the end, right, without any further ado. Somewhat to admire in greatness. That is a great difficulty for a republic. We know that from Lincoln and his speech on the perpetuation of our institutions. A great man is greatly desired by the people, but that can be quite dangerous. And Tocqueville, I think, tries to find some connection between the greatness of a great person and the greatness of a people in governing themselves. But the greatest thing that a people can do is to be able to rule itself, govern itself. This is the connection between political liberty in the ordinary sense of even the township and in the highest goals and attainments of a great man in politics. So that somehow the ability of the ordinary person is certainly contrasted with what a great person can do, and therefore with the admiration that goes with it. Still, there's a kind of self-admiration or pride that Tocqueville appeals to in the activity of political liberty.
I'm always impressed how Tocqueville aims to keep greatness and moderation together. And in your little book on Tocqueville, you quote a remark of his about Napoleon, and in so many ways he despised Napoleon, even though he was fascinated by him. But he says Napoleon was as great as a man could be without also being good.
Virtue,
without virtue, yeah. And so Tocqueville, I think, was really cognizant of the fact that political greatness needed to have that connection Harvey just spoke about to political liberty on the one hand, the greatness of a free people, but it also needed virtue and the virtue of moderation.
Bill?
I was going to say, of course, Napoleon looked at the great, he had virtues. He has an excessively edifying view of your view of Tocqueville's view of Napoleon, I decided edifying there.
He did hate it.
I can be Machiavellian for a minute, but I guess maybe I asked Harvey to say a word about the modernity of the executive power, which I think also is a question that we raised about party government and a lot of the representation of the direct government, a lot of the aspects of politics that you've written about and uncovered, which is, I think, is sort of intended. I mean, why, listening to the discussion today, one could simply say this is exactly, if it wants to do executive power, the characteristics of executive power, potential of foreign policy, domestic policy, the directness of political rule, these are all features of politics. But it's not so clear that they're distinctively modern. I mean, half the examples that are used from ancient Rome, and half the examples that the modern thinkers use to explain this are from ancient Rome, and the Federalist cites the Roman dictator as the model, or pretending it's not a model, cites this as a model for the American president's extraordinary power, and the Senate seems to be very good at this kind of masked indirect governance, and I guess we all sort of are supposed to believe, that there's this huge distinction between ancients and moderns, and therefore somehow these things must follow somehow from the peculiarly modern doctrines. But I guess just listening to the discussion and thinking about politics, thinking an awful lot of this interesting characteristic of politics, or even the greatness in a republic. I mean, Lincoln doesn't, Lincoln in the Lyceum speech cites Caesar and Napoleon, and that's, I think there's a huge difference between modern and ancient aspirations that he presents, and the problem of Pericles isn't that different probably from the problem of modern Caesarism as a modern term, isn't it used to characterize something that goes back to Caesar or Pericles or whatever. So I guess, well, why is it distinctly modern, the executive power or the ability to executive power?
Well, maybe it was just in the nature of politics, but not now differently understood. And sure, all the modern writers use ancient examples. They're in being used, they're somewhat purged of their divinity, say of the divine, so that you get a clearer sort of non-religious view of political contention in, say, the dissensions of Rome. But it's just interpreted differently. It's not including as aspiration towards something to admire, or any notion of the common good. But it's a kind of self-expression, or a purging of your humors, your bilious humors, and the attempt to stop someone else from doing it to you before, and so that you have to do it first to him. So all those things, I think are certainly features of politics always, but they've been. So what is it? Whatever the reverse of sanitized is, all the healthiness has been desanitized or taken out. What? Sullied, yes.
Or couldn't you say that from Machiavelli to Weber, the crucial political distinctions that ancient political science defended between king and tyrant, statesman and tyrant, they all get collapsed. So Machiavelli collapses that fundamental distinction. Weber puts everything in the same category of charismatic leadership. So you have the same phenomena and the same examples, but you have this political science centered around the concept of power that can't make the crucial distinctions that are central to free political life.
Well, that's the question, whether they're central, crucial, and fundamental.
Right.
Yeah. So, is that just an interpretation, or is there a real difference in behavior that can be discerned?
Harvey, if you think about it, just using Tocqueville, you have an aristocratic age, you have a democratic age. In a democratic age, you have to be accountable because government rests on the consent of the governed. And doesn't that fundamentally change the people's relationship to their rulers? To get back to your question, Bill, and Harvey asked you what you think.
One thing I've always talked about Tocqueville is that it doesn't seem to be an ancients and moderns type of guy. He seems to be an aristocrats and democrats type of guy, very organizing principle, which is not the same, obviously. Maybe it's sort of, it may overlap, but I think we were all one kind of conversation. So, the Tocqueville's account, let's say, this is real account, but his apparent account of sort of big picture history is age of aristocracy, age of democracy, which is very different from
And aristocracy includes the Greek city, the Middle Ages, American Indians. It's a very capacious category.
And the American South.
And the American South.
This Canada. Now, what always struck me about hanging the princes that you discussion with conflict, basically, not with Aristotle as he usually. And I wonder, starting off from the previous question, I think there's a difference between ancients and moderns, which has something to do with the notion of the executive, and that is that foreign policy is of infinitely greater importance for the moderns than it was for the ancients. And one of the reasons might be that international organizations or international journalism, if you want, became infinitely more important. That is true on the political level, but also on the religious level. And I would like to hear your ideas about the connection of the notion of the executive and international relations in fundamental.
Well, as Nathan was saying, the primacy of foreign policy is a consequence of the Machiavellian view of things, that you can never take things on trust. So you should look on all politics as if it's a question of friend and enemy, and friend is always more of a potential enemy than an enemy a potential friend. So that this sense of conflict and of danger, risk, is the arena of politics. And so Kant, in his way, goes along with this because you're right that what he has is essentially an international solution. It's just a kind of accident, according to his own theory, that Germans want to be Germans and French. That's sort of an unhappy fact that morality has to compromise with, indeed. So he has, because he wants to oppose Machiavelli, he has as thoroughgoing an internationalism as Machiavelli does, only in the opposite direction, in such a way as to not just encourage but require that states treat all disputes of international dominance as if they were questions of domestic law. So I think those two. It's another example of the kinship of legalism and realism.
Shep, one thing I haven't noticed yet, haven't mentioned, is Harvey's remarkable ability to annoy, shock, perturb people. I was thinking about this because I recall you first taught the seminar on this in 1974, right after Watergate, where the dangers of executive power were on exhibition. And there was an awful lot of moralism about government of law and not of men, and that need to limit executive power. And you really challenged that. In political science, the choice that we seem to have was between whether the president should be a clerk or a leader, and you pointed out that to be a leader requires you, the executive, to execute, which tended to shock people. So your unmasking is in part a justifier, to say that there's these ugly necessities that we need to deal with, which is the opposite of most unmasking. So what I suppose I'm supposed to end with a question, should it be called painting and justifying first?
So yes, Nixon and Attorney General Mitchell, Haldeman. Trying to remember all those names.
Ehrlichman.
Berlin Wall, as they would call it.
Final Jeopardy.
Don Dean, yeah. Yeah. Right. Quite a company they were. Right, but somehow they had the truth on their side, you mean? Yeah. Well, yeah. Essentially, what I was doing was bringing up the connection between Machiavelli and liberalism, which I've already commented on here. But that's I think the uncomfortable, most uncomfortable truth that underlies Watergate or so on. It might be necessary to have done what apparently Nixon didn't even do, which is yeah. No, I mean but it seems now that from what I read recently that the Watergate was only about the cover-up, and that essentially there wasn't very much at all to cover up, which Nixon didn't realize. So that was bungled from start to end.
Oh, yeah.
Dylan was from Harvard's Ethics Center. I kept thinking and reading through this essay of a lot of similarities, very distant similarities, to Carl Schmitt's critique via Hobbes of liberalism, which ends up in a similar position, which says, there is a liberal aspiration to procedural resolution of things, which over the course of the 20th century in Europe is failing over and over, particularly in Weimar Germany. And on the one hand, it comes out as a endorsement of the executive in Schmitt's way, but the dark side of that being Hitler and Article 48 of Weimar, and this question of, what it reminds liberals of the necessity of politics, as it were, but leaves them very much without many resources of how you might tame that executive. And I'm curious, are Machiavelli and Hobbes, and the whole discourse on sovereignty from Baudin and Hobbes, etc., are they ultimately ending up at the same point on this sort of issue? And is that something which, again, I think it's been said before, but the international dimension of that, as they get ramped up in Machiavelli's time, as they get ramped up in the midst of World War I and II, and to bring to the fore this problem that liberalism, as procedurally conceived, doesn't have any permanent solution to it.
Oh yeah, I think you're right about that. Carl Schmitt should have gone to Machiavelli rather than Hobbes to get it right, because already Hobbes was actually looking for some kind of liberal solution to Machiavelli's dangerous insights. So that was, he was kind of caught up. Schmitt was caught up in liberalism more than he knew or thought. So that's what he should have done. But I see Machiavelli did not want to justify the killing of millions or any such thing. It was his view was that the greatest danger to human liberty was from the church and from especially the Christian, but other religions too. And that was, I would say, his mistake. Not to see that atheism would produce even worse, much greater evils. And when it was given the kind of ideological fervor that he discovered and opposed in Christianity. You'd say that the 20th century totalitarians were Machiavelli's criticism of Christianity was that it was cruel and weak, those two things together somehow. And so that totalitarianism was cruel without being weak. So it was a good deal worse. I hesitate to blame him though maybe in some larger sense, he should have known that human beings, as Burke said, need to live under a power greater than themselves, and especially free ones.
Travis Smith. Reading aside the remark about the volume of the various virtue and money, I think we'll look at things along the lines of Heidegger, the difference between being a great writer or a great thinker and being wise. And on the topic of Dan and Bill and what are they kind of distinctively modern? I mean, there's a sort of the book here gets across a sort of cuts through things and explains things in a way that even someone like Hobbes would have essentially concurred with modern liberal individuals and society which they form together is sort of based on a sort of just barely inexplicit understanding that we're all tyrants here. Right? And we're going to be okay, actually, if we recognize that. In fact, we may be better off than we ever have been before, so long as we say, okay, we're all tyrants. We're going to appoint someone who's going to be our chief tyrant, but we won't call him that, we won't call himself that. What we're naming up prevent him from acting like the worst of tyrants is that he knows that we're all tyrants too. That's why in this chapter we're reading right now, we emphasize the human naysaying, the freedom to say no, and however unreasonable. This is the greatest offense of freedom we have in modern liberal society, then you can be sure that people are going to say, you're not supposed to do that. But that's something to reckon on. Most of the time, very well. Most people are the worst of all tyrants. Now, in the previous session, there's some right moral virtue that has to be, because we're not just bodies as objects have. So we have to treat ourselves as if we have souls. Right? If we treat ourselves as if we have souls and we're not human tyrants, we won't agree to think ourselves as simply human tyrants, even if we agree to say that we all I think there's something connected to that as if, and understanding that you in your own voice, but I'm going to see that page 274 in this, I just think it's very striking things. The use of your own voice, you write, the liberty to mean nothing more than having your right. So that is pretty
I think we're right near the end, is that right? So let's have one more comment, and
This was meant to be a transition to the next sentence.
Okay. Well, one more comment, then if Harvey wants to say anything in wrapping it up.
You've forgotten your name.
David Schaefer, that's it.
Oh, yes.
In light of what was just said about Machiavelli's concern with human liberty, how would you respond to the naive reading of The Prince, which sees Machiavelli seemingly praising the tactics not only of Cesare Borgia, but the even more horrible Agathocles and Severus, to name only a few, which would seem hardly to make him an advocate of human liberty. I'd be concerned, I have not recently reread Machiavelli's Virtue, did not do my homework, but I'm concerned how you would respond to that naive reading of The Prince as a manual for the not only busy, as you once put it, but a bloodthirsty executive.
Moses, who killed infinite numbers of men. Yeah. So he puts it on to Christianity or Judaism.
But Severus and Agathocles
were copycats. There are a lot of hidden identities in Machiavelli.
If I remember, there's one place in Machiavelli's Virtue where Harvey is explicitly critical of Machiavelli, and it's at the end of the essay on Machiavelli's political science, where he not only makes some of the points he made today about how impious cruelty has far outdistanced the pious cruelty of the past, but speaks about Machiavelli's eclipsing of the phenomena by forgetting about the soul or doing away with the soul. But it's I think it's the most emphatic criticism of Machiavelli in the book.
Okay, thank you very much, and we'll. Is there a minute pause or?
You know, like,